Welcome back to Can We Get a Minute, where we decode education policy so you don't have to. We have a very special guest today. But before we get into our conversation with our guest, where we're going to have a very, I hope, interesting and robust conversation, let's hear a question from our educator.
Hey, can you explain why I have to collect so much data? We're being told that it's needed to comply with regulations, but it takes up most of my planning period. And I don't even know what happens with all this information they're collecting.
Okay, I love this question because I definitely had this question when I was a baby teacher and my first couple of years of teaching.
So to answer this today, we have brought our favorite colleague and data expert, Ziyu. Ziyu, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ziyu Zhou, Research and Data Specialist at Alpharet. I work with data every day, and that's why I'm here to talk about data.
Ooh, love that.
Yeah, this should be great. Ziyu is a data expert at the highest level. So she's gonna be able to answer some pretty incredible questions for us today. She consults, she's who we consult when we're looking into data things. So we thought we have to
not just us, but also she's like a leading expert in the nation. People tell me all the time at conferences how jealous they are that I get to work with her. So
yeah, so we truly brought in the big guns for this one. So let's start with a fun question before we get into our data conversation. What data do we each collect in our personal lives?
Ooh, good one. I can go first. Yeah. So I, as we all know, because we've talked about it a lot on this podcast, I love to read. I read probably too much. And so I obsessively collect data on the books that I read. So not just like the name, the title, the author, but I also, obviously I rate them. Very few 5 stars this year. That's okay. But I also look at things like what medium did I read them on? Like, did I read them on my Kindle or my phone or like a physical book? And I also copy a picture of the cover so that I can remember. Oh, and I keep track of how many of the authors are women or like BIPOC folks. So those are the things that I collect.
How many books have you read so far this year coming into April?
Okay, so yesterday I finished number 76.
I was going to guess in the 60s. So I was even off. And I already made what I thought was an ambitious guess. And I was still off.
Listen, it's possible that I don't have a life. It's okay.
No, I love it. Okay, so this year, so I also track books I read, but not to that level of detail. It's like, that's inspirational to me. One thing that I'm tracking this year is when we were setting our New Year's goals, our New Year's resolutions, if you will, since the year was feeling like it was going to be an intense one, I will say in a nice way, I was like, I need to do something joyful and that's in my capacity to accomplish. So one of my goals for the year is that I am going to eat 100 crab rangoon or crab wontons over the course of the 365 days of 2025. So I actually created like a bullet journal tracker, and I have been tracking how many wontons I have had. I'm on track to finish. But it is like when I'm at a restaurant and there's like options for like different appetizers, like it does incentivize me to like if there's wontons, like you do have to go to the wontons. I highly recommend this as a New Year's resolution for anyone who's thinking for one next year. But I love to have a little bullet journal where I like get to like check off and like then can go back and like see the progress of something, like where it's all cumulative. It just makes it feel more real to me. So this has been kind of a fun one to do. All right, what about you, Ziyu? What data?
I love that one. Next year, I'll throw in something like this, so fun and so random, in my New Year resolution list, right? Mine is very serious, okay? So I am a serious runner.
Yeah.
So I love tracking my running data, my weekly mileage, how fast do I run on each run. And also I track mileage on my running shoes. So I would keep a log of how many miles have I put on for one specific pair of shoes. And then then I know when it's time for me to get a new pair, which is very exciting.
Oh, that's so
I
smart.
also track my running outfit during the winter because I'm really bad at putting on like just enough clothes to keep myself warm, but not too much to, get myself overheated. So I've been doing a pretty diligent job of keeping track of what I wear during my winter runs under different winter conditions. So that has been a fun one for me.
When is your next big race that you're training up towards?
Yeah, so I will be running the Berlin Marathon in September this year, and that will be my first trip to Europe, which I'm very looking forward to.
Wow, that's so cool. And it's not your first marathon.
It's my second. So my first was last year. This is my second one.
That's so amazing. Awesome. Yeah. So, I think it's a great place to start our conversation today because I think data comes in all shapes and sizes, right? I think when we think about data, we're thinking about like an Excel spreadsheet, which is true. That is what data is. But I think there's all different types of data, particularly the type of data that our educators are working with, like on a day-to-day basis, is going into different systems. It's being recorded different ways. It's being collected different ways. And so it's really a broader category than we think. And can you just speak to that a little bit at the top, Ziyu? Like, when we're talking about education data, like what even is education data? Like what kind of data are we even collecting on our students, on our schools, on our educators?
That is a great question. Education data encompasses a lot of things. It's not just about student test scores or demographics, which are very important data points to collect, but there are also data around enrollment, enrollment, participation in different programs, school. There are a lot of school level things that we are keeping track of, such as teacher quality, teacher experience, finances, right? Per pupil spending, and school environment, school climate, and all sorts of school level environment elements that contribute to students' experience in a school. And these data are collected at very different levels. There are classroom level data, school level data, like those I mentioned just now. And also there are district level data, state level data. And then there's also the national data that we always see on national news.
Yeah.
That's super interesting to you. I guess when I was a new teacher, I was under the impression that the federal government was making me collect data on my students. Can you talk a little bit about like what are the things that like the Fed or like maybe even the ways that they're collecting data? Maybe there's like a specific tool that they use for something that you could share about versus the things that like my principal was telling me to do.
Yeah, so this might be slightly different when it comes to different data collection tools that the federal government uses. But in general, the federal government collects data through school districts and or states. And of course, states and school districts collect data from schools. So it's more of a level up, if that makes sense. And they collect these data through different survey tools or data systems submission. That's either annually, biannually, or whatever cadence that they do. Sometimes they do school pulse data that's once a month, but only for a sample of schools or districts. But then they also have national, more large-scale data collection that is mandatory for every single public school and public district.
Can you give us an example of one of those mandatory ones?
Yeah. The CRDC, or the Civil Rights Data Collection, which is administered by the Office of Civil Rights under the U.S. Department of Education. It is a mandatory data collection for all public schools and public school districts across the nation.
And why, I think one of the things, and this goes beyond data in education, is I think people are increasingly feeling overwhelmed by the technical nature of our world. You know what I mean? Like if I go into my this is my personal email on any day, I have like hundreds of spam messages that I have to clear out before I get to like anything utilizable. I know everyone, like many people have this same experience. If you don't, like, write to the podcast just to me personally, because I need to know how you handled it. But like we're constantly surrounded by like pings and systems, and like it just feels like we're doing a lot. If you think about even a few decades ago, people just weren't like having to carry around their phones and be like inundated with all this stuff. And I worry that sometimes the conversation around education data gets mixed up into this kind of feeling that things have gotten overly technical. Like people are like, back in the day when it was like a one-room schoolhouse, like we weren't collecting data on anything. And it's, you know, it's almost like this weird nostalgia. And I think people lose track of like what this data actually does that's so important. So could you talk a little bit, Ziyu, like thinking here about our educators who are listening, many of whom probably understand the importance of data, but like are getting asked these questions by parents, maybe even by other teachers. Sometimes maybe they're asking them themselves in their head when they're tired at the end of the day, right? Like, why do we need to be collecting all this data? What does it do at the end of the day? Why is it valuable?
I think this is the difference between anecdotal data that you observe in your daily life, in your classroom or in your school or from your neighborhood, right? From your kids that they are telling you, or your students are saying things about this, or if you're an educator, you observe this in your classroom, but you don't know what's been happening at your school, in your district, at the state level or nationally. So for an education system as complicated as it is, we really need this data at the system level to really understand what are the trends, what are the patterns, so that we can identify, and by we, I mean not only the general public or the nerds, you know, the researchers, but also the policymakers and educators who, you know, they are uniquely positioned to use this data to be empowered to make changes in their classrooms and advocate for their students. So these data are used to be, this data is used to identify equity gaps, opportunity gaps, and also gaps in achievement, and many other things like this that can impact a student's education journey.
This is such a powerful thing that you've said. I think, you know, something that we as educators know is that when you know what happens within the walls of your classroom, but you close that door and you like do your best for your kids, but you don't know what's happening next door. You literally do not know what's happening next door. You can have ideas, but you don't know. And that's just like within your own school building. And the importance of this data is because for a long time, like to Jen's point and like this nostalgia thing, you know, what was happening in a schoolhouse in Washington State where you grew up, Jen, was very different than what was happening in mine in Buffalo, New York, right? So like we realized while Jen and I were kids back in the day, that we were doing a disservice to some of the kids in our country. And so we had to do better. And I mean, frankly, that's why we have a Department of Education that was saying like, oh, hold on, we need to make sure that every child in this nation is getting a high quality education. And this is a tool to use to be able to drive that positive change.
Yeah, I love that. I love that differentiation. Also, right now, I think we as a country, maybe as a world, I won't just limit it to America. I'll toss this one out to everyone. We're having a real problem, I think, with the proliferation of the internet and like people feeling they have access to everything. The difference between like my anecdotal observation of one thing and being like, well, you know, everywhere. It's like it's become very blurred. And you're right. Like the ability to bring it down to the raw facts and say, is this a pattern and trend? And if it is, what's working to solve it? And be able to like look at those things is so critically important. And one of the things I think a lot of people may not be aware of, even in the education space, is some of the work our Department of Education does in research. And could you talk a little bit about, and I will use an acronym here for a second, but like IES and some of the things they do and like how they're actually not just collecting and looking, but like also pushing to use that data to ask questions and proactively make things better.
Yeah. So if you have been following federal, education news, you would probably know that very unfortunately that this administration has made the decision to cut many grants that are from IES, which stands for the Institute of Education Sciences. So if you don't know, it is an independent research and statistics and evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education. So like its name suggests, IES provides scientific research and scientific evidence to support education policies and practices that work for students. And they also share data and their scientific research findings with educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and everyone under the sun. So they have been doing a lot of work at the federal level, using taxpayers' money to do good for students and for the future of our generation, because without research and data, you don't understand what works for whom and what works for whom under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. And it's really important when it comes to instructional practices, curriculum, academic interventions, and all sorts of services that you provide for students in the school setting, that it is evidence-based and it is supported by science. And that is what IES and many other research arms of the U.S. Department of Education has been doing. And to be honest, this is not something that can be done at this level of rigor in a school district. Mm-hmm. And if you're a wealthy school district, yes, you may be doing something that is amazing for your school district, but what about other school districts that cannot afford their own research team, that cannot afford having a robust data system? They need this critical research academic support, research support, and technical support from the federal government to be able to know what works, and they can just go ahead and implement with the technical support that they also get from the federal government.
Yeah. And, people should realize that the work that IES does also celebrates the incredible work that educators are doing, right? Like, it's a way to, as you, the word that you use, validate the work that we know is happening. But without it, we don't have, we can say 7 kids or something like that. But if something is transforming a district, and frankly, we know leaders who are transforming school districts and schools and classrooms, without IES, there's no way for us to show the world, as Jen said, but also to make sure that that transformation and that power can happen for other folks in other places. Yeah. And as you and Jen, I know that, you've all heard news about IES and what's been happening lately, but could you all share a little bit about what it is that's happening for the folks that are listening?
Yeah, I can jump in a little on this, CU, but please feel free to supplement or to tell me if I get anything wrong. So, essentially, I know we've talked about in previous episodes the kind of dismantling of the Department of Education and what that has actually meant, right? I think we had that great conversation with Blair about some of the terms being thrown around and ways that this could or could not be done. But the reality of what's happened right now is where we stand today at the release of this podcast, which could be different even a few weeks from now, is what we have is layoffs in a really mass number. So some of the teams have just been gutted, and that has a big impact, obviously, on things. But also some of the funding has actually been cut for programs. And now there are lawsuits. This is not limited to ed. This is a lot of different government offices have had different programs and grants cut or terminated. And there are lawsuits to reinstate some of those. And it's kind of a legal mess at the moment. So it's hard to even parse out which ones are in which lawsuit and what lawsuit might put back or freeze or release funds. Depending on how a grant operated or how money flowed, some of these programs would spend money and then ask for reimbursement. Some they proactively give money. So those are all different lawsuits and different ways they have to challenge them, which is why this is so deeply complex. But in particular, what we saw with the department the Department of Education, among other things, like Ziyu said, a lot of the funding that flowed through IES, this research arm for people to do this research, has been taken away and stopped. So that in particular, and like I said, this one actually isn't limited to ed. We've seen research funds dry up for a lot of departments. So this was consistent with that decision by the administration. But for ed, this is how that hits us here. So where we are right now, like I said, there's lots of legal action. Will this stand? Will it come back? Will it be frozen? Like, we just don't have those answers. But as we are today, those funds are at best in jeopardy, at worst gone.
And to put a number on it, what we know, which sometimes it's hard to know because information is not being shared very freely, but what we know is that about $900 million in contracts were axed, and that's an astronomical number. But to be clear, it's not like $900 million for like federal workers. This is people in universities. This is like organizations that are doing like incredible research and like learning that are now just gone.
Yeah. And I think there's sometimes, just to like clarify this one point, and I think Blair made this point very well as well when we had him on. There's this analogy that's been floating around that like the government can budget like a household budgets, and it is logically, it's a fallacy. And the thing about how the government has to budget, because we have a very large, complex government, and we want it to be complex. We are a complex nation. We're very, very large, very diverse, spread out over a very wide geographical space. So like, we wouldn't want it to be simple. It would not be working in that case. So we have this sense that like, let's say you're saying we axe 900 million in research grants. That money isn't going to like flow and every teacher is going to get a pay bump. That's not how the government works. Like, funds are collected and distributed. Sometimes there's programs that match funds. Like if a state puts in money, then the government adds from that money. Sometimes private philanthropy adds to money. Like if a research org can get money from the federal government, it only pays for like a third or a half of a project, and then private philanthropy pays for the rest. Like there's a really complex network of how things get funded, right? Depending on what they are and who's running them. And there are guardrails to make sure that the money is going good places. And I want to be clear, sometimes those guardrails fail. And that's why we need like systems to check for like fraud and systems to check for abuse, legitimate systems I'm talking about here. But this sense, like in your household, if you said, I'm not going to get a coffee every morning, then that money would just be in your bank account and you could use it on whatever you wanted. So you could go buy yourself a pair of shoes at the end of the week, right? Like you could do whatever you wanted with that money. That's not how the government works. When that money is not spent there, it goes into certain buckets, but it doesn't go into others. And some of these systems are completely disentangled. For example, like I said, educator pay, which is determined on the state and even local levels. That federal research money doesn't flow back down there in the same way. And so sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. Like I said, this is like so complex. And there's people who not even us in this call, there's people who spend their whole lives just working on these federal financing systems because they're so complicated. But I do think it's important to realize when we're talking about like when the research money is gone, it doesn't necessarily mean like your school is going to get a check to get school supplies. Like the systems are separated. And so I just think that is an important part that's missing from the system is like, the data is important on itself. This work is important on its own, but also I know there's needs in our classrooms. I know the educators listening today, you could list 1 million, and that's very, very real. But we don't want people to be able to sell cutting a good system with a false promise you're going to get something that you need. We instead want to advocate for a real solution for you to get what you need, and also to get the research we need done for you and for our kids. And so I think that's where the conversation needs to go. And honestly, if we had more educators at the table, that's where the conversation would be, because many of them understand these things very fundamentally.
Yeah, Jen, I think we will get more into like the impacts on education itself and what these changes could and probably, frankly, will mean. But there's also impacts on community. This $900 million didn't get cut out of Washington, D.C. Like, it's not only affecting the town that I live in. Like, these are researchers across the nation, and these are people who are losing their jobs, which means that they're not going to shop at the grocery store, and they're not going to go to the auto mechanic, and they're like, or they might have to move. Like, this will affect communities. Not only will it affect your classroom in terms of like the things that we'll talk about with CU, like maybe not tomorrow, but like long-term effects, but it will also affect your community.
Yeah. I also, one of the things that I've been hearing is if we don't have like a federal data collection mechanism in education, we'll just allow the states to collect, which I think myself doing state work and ZU, I know you do a lot of state work. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about state data, because we constantly have this thing when we try to, there's certain data points we want to find that are collected by states. And when we have to do a comparison nationwide, that data is not apples to apples. It's like there is a huge, like, you need someone like ZU to come in and interpret from one state to the other. Can you just explain for people who maybe haven't gone through that process, ZU, what it means when every state collects their own data, as they do in some of these areas, and the difficulties of then comparing that across our country, state by state by state?
Yeah, so there's the statewide longitudinal data system, SLDS, which is basically a statewide system. That exists in, I think, most states, that collects data from all the way from early childhood to K-12 education, then to post-secondary education, and then to the workforce. And it's really a system of data collection that tracks students from the very early stage of their life to the time when they entered the workforce. And it's a very complex data system that every state has, or almost every state has. And it is important to keep in mind that we've been allowing states to do this their own thing for a long time. And what we've got at this point, as of now, is not ideal. And there's still lots of room for improvement. And that is why there is the SLDS, or Statewide Longitudinal Data System Grant Program, that is funded by the federal government to help states build, update, and implement, and ultimately use data from their longitudinal data system to make sure they are providing the correct information and driving research at the state and local level to help improve their student outcomes. So these are very important data systems that states have been building with their local context, with their own data people, their data team, in collaboration with their schools and districts and employers and early childhood agencies to bring all the data points together. But the reality is states lack the capacity and expertise to do this thing. And without federal support, without the grant program and other, which is not only just competitive grants, which means money. It's not just about money. It's the expertise, it's the capacity, it's the technical assistance that the federal government and their team has been providing that is critical for states to build and maintain and use their systems.
ZU, I know you're in the midst of, actually both of you are in the midst of a project that is looking at just 6 states. And can you tell us a little bit about like some of the challenges when you're trying to pull data points from these different states and what that looks like when you're trying to like do an analysis of what's going on in those places?
I think one thing I noticed is some states somehow choose to collect data on different things. They're very similar. For example, we were looking at states' CTE programs, and some states choose to collect their data around this aspect of CTE, whereas the other states would choose to collect data around the other aspect. And they're not 100% perfectly aligned. And it's really hard when you really want to get what percentage of students are doing XYZ from one state to another. It somehow you can't find the exact thing you're looking for all states that you're looking at. And it's frustrating, but also confusing, right? Because you think, oh, how come you think about doing this, but you somehow choose not to? So that has been a struggle in our research with Jan.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it's interesting because right now in particular, we have a lot of states that are in a very tight budgetary reality. And so in education in particular, you'll hear people say like, oh, we want to try this new thing or try this new type of pathways program. And the reality is one of the things we have going for us in the United States of America, we have all these states that have tried all these things. And often another state has already tried this. And like, was it successful? Was it not successful? Like we should be learning from these things, but it can be very difficult to pull that data in a way that's communicable outside of the state. So if you, for example, want to take a comparison to even two states that are right next door to each other that have completely different like systems on some aspect, like maybe it's like dual enrollment or it's, college career pathways or some like CTE program, and they're doing two completely different things. And you want to say, okay, well, which one has been more successful? And you have to define success. But often those two states aren't collecting or presenting that data in the same way. So you have to look at what they are collecting and then try to make those two things kind of work together to come to a conclusion. And it's, if everybody had the same data, it would be easy to draw these conclusions or to see like what's actually working where and like under what circumstances, like you said before, which I think is really important aspect of this. But because many of our states use a completely different system from even their neighbors, the data just doesn't always match up and you can't always draw those through lines. So like Washington state can tell a story about itself in its data system, but it can't tell a story about how it relates to Idaho or Oregon, its immediate next door neighbors. And so, that ultimately is a problem. And like I said, some states have actually formed regional partnerships and are trying to address this, but there is no effort to address this on a nationwide level other than the work the federal government is doing to bring that data together and make it communicable. They actually go to states and say, no, you have to provide us this data in this way so that we can draw these cross-cutting comparisons. That's the whole point of it. So if that were to completely go away and not return, we would be back to just 50 completely different systems that may choose to work together, maybe in like tiny partnerships. So you might see some regional partnerships form, but like at the end of the day, I wouldn't be able to say, how does Louisiana's like dual enrollment success look compared to Wyoming's? And what can we learn from that? Like you could, but it'd be hard. You'd have to go into the raw data. You'd have to do, it would cost a lot of money versus like having one unified system where we're collecting in the same way. And so I think that this is some of the things that we see when we do research already is with these data points that are not federally collected. States just have completely different systems, completely different things they ask, completely different things they collect, completely different ways they report. So you're essentially looking at completely different systems and trying to make them sing together. Yeah.
Could you talk, we've talked about data, like big word data, but there's also like the importance of data just like in your own classrooms and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about like those, even just like the way that we collect data on our own lives, like how are those things powerful for teachers? Because I know that data sometimes feels like a dirty word for some of us teachers because of like when we're thinking about these big things and we were like, oh no, but the reality is that there's a lot of power there.
Yeah. I think the concerns that educators have around data, whether that's, the accountability pressure, right? They are afraid which is a very valid concern, that they're afraid that they are going to be held accountable for students' achievement when sometimes it's the external factors or factors that they cannot control that also contribute to a student test score. Or other administrative burden type of concern, which I also understand. But on the flip side, I think teachers do recognize the power of data because like you mentioned earlier, Rebecca, teachers need to see the data, to see that, to be valid, to feel validated that the work that they have put in has yield results. And you cannot see results without collecting data. And that is just something that you need to invest in and be fully on board with to really see the benefits of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think sometimes people think that that process of data collection, they're like, oh no, like I have more, like another thing on my list. But the reality is teachers are collecting data all the time. Sometimes, you know, some magical ones like file them away in their heads. But I bet if you walked into a classroom today, every teacher has like a notebook, a notepad, a little note on their computer, a bunch of sticky notes everywhere where they're like, Johnny did, da, 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 da. And like those things are really powerful, even if they're just for you.
Yeah, I saw there was recently I saw there was this TikTok video where a parent was complaining because her child has an accommodation where they do half days. And she was saying the class had this cupcake party that they'd earned and the teacher had scheduled it for the second half of the day. And she was kind of blaming the teacher. And in the comments, it was hundreds of teachers being like, listen, I've been doing this for 10 years. And what I'll tell you is, you cannot do a pizza party, a cupcake party in the first half of the day. You will lose the rest of the day because like blah, 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 blah. And they're like, so we need a solution because we don't want this kiddo to be excluded. But they were like, let me explain to you, like, if you have a cupcake party before 11 a.m., like, here's what's going to happen. And these are teachers like across the world, right? So the thing is like teachers have like they're walking repositories of data. Just because it's not in a system doesn't mean they're not collecting. But they know like, when I go into, you know, one of my friends or siblings' classrooms, you know, they know if I set the day up this way, or if I don't have this specific thing happening when the kids come in this morning, it's going to set the day up wrong. Like they have all of that is like sometimes soft data, but like they have these data understandings of how to make the classroom successful down to, you know, you see teachers set up the colors of the classroom, the way the bulletin boards look, those are data points that are gained from experience, that are gained from the mentorship of more senior teachers and educators. And, you know, these are really important systems as well. And I think sometimes these data points and systems don't get communicated to policymakers, which is why it's so important that we have educators at the table, because they have a very inherent data capacity and understanding of how to make a day successful. And, you know, sometimes the things policymakers do throw disruption into the data they know, but it's like teachers inherently know, like, they're like, that won't work. And that's based on that's based on years and years of having tried different things and heard different experiences. But yeah,
I think that is a great point because data itself, it's just numbers. Yeah. But what educators can really add value here, like you said, Jen, they have context, they have experience, and that's why they are the ultimate value add to the data, because they have context. So when they see the data, they can spot what's wrong in the data, like the anomaly, right? They know what's not correct, and they can spot that like immediately because they know their students, they know their classrooms, they know the building so well that they can actually add value and add context to the data to make sure that the data is interpreted in the right way. And that we are not just jump to conclusions based on numbers, but based on context and numbers.
I love that.
Yeah, that's amazing. With that, I think let's talk about what teachers can do if this was something that was interesting to them, or if they're worried about what's going on with IES and other things, because I'm sure also like within states, there are some states that are doing some interesting things that could be harmful too.
So I think our first tier today is just having an understanding yourself of how the data is utilized and the data that you're putting into the data that you're collecting. Like always, you know, just joining us here today is already so much. We know how much is already going on for our educators. So just understanding the value of the data systems and, you know, working to be part of that system in your day-to-day classroom. Like that if that's all you have to give right now, capacity wise on this, I think that's already an incredible get. Like teachers are our data collectors in the field. So like you're already a vital part of the system.
100%. And then, something that's important on the second tier there is sharing this information. And, I've sat in a lot of break rooms where people are complaining about this data collection. So now that you understand a little bit more on the why and what's at stake here, we really encourage you to share this with not just your fellow teachers, but also parents when they're coming in, because people are really confused, and what you're hearing on the news is not necessarily what the reality is in terms of this. So just like helping people really like put it into context on like why this is important, why this matters, and what the impact could be for education going forward.
Yeah. And then I think if you are excited about data, if this is your one, you want to get in the mix, there are a lot of different things that you can work on here. There's the things that are happening at the federal level with the defunding of some of our data and research systems. Also at your state level, ZU mentioned the SLDS, the state longitudinal data systems. If your state is in the midst of creating one, is considering one, these are decisions that are made at the state level, like in your legislature. But there's actually like hearings and votes on things like that. And then once they are instituted, your district and your school board will have hearings about like how to get the specific data into those systems. There's also often task forces and working groups with those where they actually talk about like how to integrate workforce data or what, points they should look at that are important. They often have seats reserved for educators on those task forces and working groups. So if you really wanted to get involved in this, you could put yourself up for one of those seats and actually get your hands in the mix on this. This is something that educators, there should be more than one educator seat. Like that's just like Jen talking. That's something you could advocate for as well. But actually get at the table in some of these conversations, right? So that is a piece for sure. I also think, as Rebecca was saying about like the break room, just because the data is valuable doesn't mean we're always collecting it in the way that's least burdensome, right? A lot of the people who create these systems are not in the classroom. Some of them have not had any classroom experience. So also sharing your insight and expertise, getting on these commissions and working groups and task forces and sharing out how, so we want this data. Let's agree there. But the way we're currently collecting it is getting in the way of your school day. That's a solvable problem, but we need educators to step forward and share that experience and share solutions. So this is someplace I would tell you that an educator voice can be very, very powerful. And I think there's a hunger for it, but we have to create those spaces, and then we have to fill those spaces at the table with you who are listening. So if this is something you want to get involved in, I think data, it's far from boring. I mean, data is how we actually analyze and build and innovate in the system. So there are lots of opportunities here. And I encourage anyone who feels like excited about this to pursue it. You'd be surprised how few people put themselves up for stuff, right? Like, especially on the local and state level, like for these task forces and working groups, it's not like hundreds and hundreds of teachers who are clamoring to get, I wish it was, but often it's not. So, go take that seat at the table if that's you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be fair, I think sometimes teachers, one, are very busy, but two, they don't necessarily know. They don't necessarily advertise.
No, they don't advertise it.
That these spots are for them, but they do belong to you and you have every right to be there. In fact, you should be the first people at that table. So that's a really great tip, Jen. I love that. With that, we really want to thank you. Thanks for being our favorite colleague.
Yes, and thank you for coming and joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like what you said was really, really powerful. I love data, as we know, but I am like, I know this much, and ZU knows like the world, and so we're just so thankful that you were here with us and you were able to like offer such great insight, but also like inspiration as well.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for spending a minute of your day with us here, which we know are very valuable. And we will see you next week when we have our season finale for season 1 of our Can We Get a Minute podcast.